We're gonna switch orientations for a little bit to sort of poise us for the afternoon's discussion, and I'd like to introduce Shannon Frattaroli. Make sure I got that one right. And she is actually an assistant professor in the Department of Health Policy and Management at the Bloomberg School of Public Health. She's also affiliated with the Center of Injury Research and Policy and the Center for Gun Policy and Research, and her research interests involve understanding the role of policy in improving the health of populations, with particular attention to the effects of firearm injury prevention policies, the implementation of public health policies, and the role of advocacy in communities in the policy process. She does a lot of qualitative research, and what she's going to talk about today is what is in fact implementation science, so that she can set the stage for us to sort of understand how we take what we've heard this morning, plus some of the exciting new projects that are going to be discussed this afternoon. How do we take that information and actually think about how to implement it and translate it into settings where we can improve the health of women?
Well, thanks very much for the introduction, and thanks for having me here today. Although I must say, I feel like I'm in the unenviable position of both following Ann Coker and also standing between you and lunch here. So with that caveat, let's get started. I want to thank Michelle for inviting me to be here. I think the timing for this subject matter with regard to the field really couldn't be better. As we've started to hear about, there's a lot of evidence that shows what effective interventions are for the field. And we're going to hear more about that this afternoon. So we're really in a position where a lot of efficacy trials have been held, and we know what works. The challenge for us really is how do we make those efficacy interventions work in broader populations? How can we bring them to scale? And that's really what implementation science is all about. So my plan for today, here's where I get into trouble because I'm a Mac person. So my plan for today is to accomplish a few things. First of all, as was mentioned, I want to provide a brief overview of what exactly is implementation science. What does it mean when we say those words? So we're going to start off with an overview of that. Then we're going to have a discussion that talks about applying implementation science to the field of intimate partner violence, and specifically by using a case example of some recently completed work that I've been involved with around an intervention involving domestic violence and guns in California. And the plan is that with these two sets of topics, both this primer on implementation science that's going to be more theoretical, complemented by a very practical example of what implementation science looks like, we'll be well positioned to move into the afternoon session and really think very carefully about what implementation science can do for us as we move forward to think about how to achieve that goal that we're also interested in accomplishing, which is real reductions in violence against women. So with that introduction, let's talk a little bit about what implementation science is. So in the past decade or so, there's been a real flurry of interest around this concept of implementation science. And it's really grown out of an increasing recognition that there's been a lot of good research that's been going on, and we've learned a lot through that research. But truth be told, we haven't been so good about bringing it to the population and really realizing the population level effects that we all want to see occur. So that's really the motivation behind this interest in implementation research is why is it that we have answers to what works, but we haven't seemed to solve the problems that these studies have been aimed at addressing? So very simply put, implementation as defined by this book here that I've pictured here that was just, I think Anne mentioned that June is going to be a big month. I think 2012 is a big year for us. This book was just published and released a couple months ago, and so these definitions that I have here are from this book. It's really a wonderful, comprehensive review of implementation research. And what they define implementation as is probably, it's a simplistic definition, right? It probably won't surprise anyone in the room here. They say implementation is really the process of putting to use or integrating evidence-based interventions within a setting. Simple enough. And that implementation research specifically seeks to understand the processes and factors that are associated with successful integration of evidence-based interventions within a particular setting. So that all seems very logical and good and very much in line with what we in the field of intimate partner violence need to be focusing on at this point in time. What I want to emphasize, though, is that a lot of this work, if you purchase this book or check it out from your local library, a lot of what you'll see is an emphasis on clinic-based interventions. And that's important for us. We know that screening is an incredibly powerful tool that we have, and we're very excited about the policy recommendations that are soon going to be in force. But we need to be looking ahead and understanding beyond sort of the clinical setting, what else can we do in the community with regard to programs and policies to assure that those women who are screened in clinic have access to good working programs that can ultimately lead to those reductions that we're all hoping for. So the clinic is important, and a lot of the activity that's being sponsored by NIH, that's being sponsored by AHRQ, is really focused on those clinical interactions, and they provide a lot of good information about how we can engage in implementation studies to better understand how to be effective in the clinical setting. But it's important to recognize that we need more. We need to also be thinking about implementation in the context of community settings, and we need to be thinking about implementation in the context of the policies that we seek and pass with regard to intimate partner violence. And so when we think about that broader kind of frame for implementation science, from my perspective, what we need to be looking at is the current sort of literature and dialogue that's happening around the biomedical contributions. So there's a lot coming out of NIH, the Clinical Translation Science Awards. There's a lot that is happening at the clinical intervention point that is going to be valuable to us, but we also need to sort of expand our view, in my opinion, to look at the behavioral sciences literature, which has for decades really taught us a lot about the diffusion of innovations and stages of change and how behavior happens over the course of time. It's not oftentimes a one-shot deal in which we see change happen, but rather it's something that happens through repeated efforts and through changes that occur slowly and gradually over time. So it's important to keep that literature in mind. It's also important, if we're going to be talking about policy, to look at some very valuable contributions that have been made by policy scientists with regard to how policies are implemented. So the policy sciences implementation literature really holds some valuable information that you don't tend to see referenced in a lot of the clinical translation science information. But again, as we look ahead to what we in the field of intimate partner violence are going to be needing to focus on, these literatures in behavioral science are important, and in the policy sciences are also important. So what does the behavioral science literature teach us? Well, again, what I sort of distill from looking in that literature is that when we think about implementation, behavior change is an important part of that process. So Jackie was sharing with us some of the details on that recent study. So there was an intervention, and clinicians were provided with resources to hopefully intervene with patients who screened positive, and they didn't. So why is that? What is needed in order to get those clinicians to not just take the information, but to take that extra step and engage with their patients who they know are screening positive for violence. What is it that the behavioral science literature can tell us in order to better understand those processes so that those interventions can be more effective in actually getting women connected to services? So we know that behavioral change theory can inform an understanding of how implementation processes work, and more importantly, how we can intervene in these implementation processes to make good things happen. And sort of like others who have gone before me this morning, I'm not going to talk much more about the behavioral sciences literature, in part because there is a hot off the presses article that I think is just fantastic that I'll point you toward. It's coming out in Implementation Sciences. It's actually available online right now, and it provides a very nice framework for thinking about implementation of clinic-based interventions using a behavior change framework. And this is not an example that's rooted in the IPV world, but it is, I think, very relevant just in terms of teaching us how to incorporate the behavioral literature and how to move forward with both implementation interventions and implementation studies to assure that efficacious interventions that we've identified are going to have the maximum benefit. So I encourage you to look at this if you'd like to learn more about what kind of behavioral sciences interventions can be applied to implementation interventions. What I'd like to spend the majority of my time talking about is what the policy implementation literature can teach us. And as I mentioned, as we think about moving beyond the clinic and really delivering the interventions and services to women who screen positive, policy is an incredibly, incredibly powerful tool. And again, as I look through the decades of literature that has been put forward through the policy sciences literature on the policy implementation process, there's basically three things that I walk away with. One is that when we think about policy implementation, we need to pay attention to the process of formulating those policies. So the decisions that are made by the legislatures with regard to what policies look like have implications for how those policies are implemented. So the policy details matter. So what does that tell us? That we as advocates, we as researchers, we as professionals in the field of intimate partner violence need to be paying attention to what our politicians are doing with regard to policies that affect the people that we care about, because their decisions matter with regard to what happens in the field. The other thing that I take away from this literature is that people are also very important. The stakeholders who are responsible for implementing our policies have some discretion. They have leeway in how they're going to be implementing these policies. And I think that we, as a society, tend not to think about this when we think about policy interventions. I think there's a tendency to say, well, policy happens and then people just kind of do whatever the policy says. But there's study after study, a rich literature, which shows that that just isn't the case. We need to be paying more attention to the stakeholders who are responsible for implementing the policies we pass, and not to assume that just because a legislator somewhere decided that this was going to be, that that is how it's actually happening in the field. And finally, the third main thing that I take away from the policy implementation literature is really the importance of understanding the context in which policies are happening. So oftentimes what we see in the literature is that policies at the implementation phase either succeed or fail based on whether or not the context is really conducive for implementation to occur. So if there is something that's happening that's really dominating the agenda of the implementing agency, it doesn't matter if a new policy has come down and told them that they need to do something. So whether there's time, whether there's resources in order for a policy to be implemented is really important from what we know in the policy implementation literature. So that's sort of my basic 5-minute overview of what kind of literatures I think can really help us to move forward in the IPV world in this era of a greater emphasis on screening and in terms of really maximizing the evidence base that we have at our disposal. What I'd like to do now is to really move forward and to share with you an example of some implementation research and the findings that have come from that from an example in California. As was mentioned, I'm affiliated here at Hopkins with a couple of centers, one the Center for Injury Research and Policy, and the other is the Center for Gun Policy and Research. And it's really the second of those centers that is really motivating the focus for this particular issue. So we all know that intimate partner violence is a huge, huge problem in this country and worldwide. What I like to think about are strategies where we can really have a quick impact in the policy world. And when I look at sort of the epidemiology of intimate partner violence, one of the things that really stands out to me is the really important role that firearms have in intimate partner violence. And again, we know from some good studies that have been out there that firearms are an important risk factor for femicide in intimate partner violence. And some work that's been done, again, Jackie Campbell's paper here is listed, some really strong work that really shows the independent risk factor associated with the presence of a firearm in a battering relationship is really going to be predictive of whether or not a femicide occurs. So from my perspective, there's a lot of good reasons to focus on guns in intimate partner violence. One is that they're a leading cause of death for women in violent relationships. Again, we know that they're a significant risk factor for femicide. We also know from some good work that's come out of California that in addition to being associated with that most severe form of intimate partner violence, which is homicide, that there's also a good amount of evidence that shows that they're also quite involved in non-fatal abuse. So Susan Sorensen a few years back published a study in the American Journal of Public Health in which she did a series of interviews with women in shelter in California and documented the fact that of women who were living in homes where guns were kept, fully 2/3 of them reported that the guns were part of their abuse. So guns, we've known for a long time that they're important in homicide and the most severe forms of violence, but recent evidence is really teaching us about the role that they have in abuse of all kinds. So that's another reason to focus on guns. And the other reason, from my perspective, is that guns really offer a very tangible intervention point from my perspective. They're a product that we can put our hands on. They're regulated to some extent in this country. And so they provide a real opportunity to really intervene and remove a weapon that we know are associated with very severe abuse. And not insignificantly, from a political perspective, we also know from polling data that when we ask people in this country about what they think about policies that aim to restrict batterers' access to guns, that there's overwhelming support for policies that aim to remove guns from batterers, both among people who don't own guns and among gun owners. So from a political perspective, this is a fairly palatable policy option. So where does that lead us? Well, for all of those reasons, I'm happy to report that a number of states have actually taken some important action on the issue of guns and domestic violence. So about half the states in this country have one of two laws that I think of are very important with regard to guns and domestic violence. When we looked at the different laws in states around the country to see which states had one of two laws that either allowed police to remove guns when responding to a domestic violence incident or allowed courts to order respondents to protective orders to order guns removed, fully, more than half of the states had laws on the books where these laws were present. So the purple states on this map are states where both of those laws take place. The orange laws are the states where they just have that court authority, and the blue states are those where the police authority exists. And what we've seen over the years is a couple of evaluations that show in laws where the court authority exists, again, where judges are authorized to issue orders that include a provision to remove guns from the hands of people under an active protective order, that we see a reduction in intimate partner homicide. So there's great potential in what these laws show. However, when we sort of look around and really see how these laws are implemented, we also see that there's great potential for better implementation of these laws because it's hard to find law enforcement authorities who can actually speak about interventions that they have in place to realize full implementation of these laws. So what does this mean? We have these laws in many states. We have some evidence that suggests that they can be effective in terms of preventing intimate partner homicide. How do we move that to the next step? Well, an opportunity presented itself in the state of California a few years back when then Attorney General Bill Lockyer initiated a task force that looked at generally what kind of enforcement is going on around intimate partner violence laws in the state. There was really a sense that we're not doing our best with regard to protecting women from intimate partner violence, and we're really not using all the resources to our disposal. This report was by no means specific to the gun issue, but it did include as one of its findings a mention of California's law around guns and an acknowledgement that there wasn't really much being done in order to assure that batters had their firearms removed as a result of being subject to restraining orders in the state. So what did this lead to? Well, the people in California decided to use some resources that they had at their disposal to set up an implementation intervention. And what did that look like? Well, they went to 2 counties in California and said, we have this law in the books. We have this law in the books that says people who are subject to a restraining order cannot purchase or possess guns. How are we going to realize that law? So they reached out to these 2 counties and gave some funds to 2 sheriff's departments and charged them with setting up a system for realizing full implementation of this law. They were charged with developing a system to confiscate and facilitate relinquishment of firearms to people subject to restraining orders, and there was also a charge to make sure that they were educating people about the laws regarding possession and confiscation of firearms to people who were subject to restraining orders. So those 2 counties were selected, and again, in their I think, infinite wisdom, the folks at the California Department of Justice didn't just put in place an implementation intervention, they also wanted an assessment of how that intervention went. They wanted to make sure that they learned from that experience. And so a group of us here at Hopkins were able to partner with folks at the University of California, Davis to essentially evaluate the implementation process of that law. And our charge as implementation researchers was to really work with the pilot communities in developing their materials to help them along the way, to document the process of implementing the interventions, and to also provide them with real-time feedback as to how the implementation intervention was going. So the idea was really to maximize the resources that were going into these 2 counties to assure that they could put their best foot forward in terms of realizing full implementation of these laws. So it was a really exciting opportunity to really be on the forefront of some implementation research. The 2 counties that were selected were very different counties. I don't know if we have any Californians here, but the 2 counties that were selected were San Mateo County and Butte County. Probably San Mateo County is familiar to some of you. That's a county south of San Francisco here. And it's a very high-tech county. A lot of Silicon Valley jobs are there. Generally, it's a higher income than the rest of the state. It's a large, not an urban population, but a densely populated suburban area of the state. In contrast, the intervention was also going into Butte County, which is a very small rural county northwest of Sacramento, where a lot of farming happens. There's a lot of hunting that goes on. And in our initial site visits to Butte County, when we told people that we were interested in working on the gun issue, without fail, what we heard from the people we were working with was, oh, everybody here owns guns. We're all hunters. It's very much a rural community where a gun is part of our makeup. In contrast, in San Mateo County, we didn't hear those kinds of things. People tend not to be gun owners in San Mateo County. So we had two very different communities that were part of this implementation intervention. And I think a very telling sort of first lesson here, when the sheriff's offices were charged with this task of implementing this law, one of the first things that they did was to reach out and form these expansive implementation teams. So in each county, what we saw were not just the sheriff's offices taking the lead on implementing this law, but they brought in representatives from the courts, representatives from the prosecutor's office. They reached out to victim advocates. They included local police departments on their implementation teams. They were very open to having us be a part of their team efforts to figure out how to implement this law. And they also invited the California Department of Justice to play a part. California Department of Justice oversees databases that essentially track firearm purchases in the state. So they were viewed as a really critical partner to all of this. And from our perspective, in terms of collecting research and really evaluating the implementation effort, we relied on a number of data sources in order to do that. So we knew that, again, from the policy implementation literature, that we wanted to learn a lot from the implementers themselves. So we set up a study design that included in-depth interviews with the key implementation people. We asked them to collect detailed case data from all of the cases that they followed. And they agreed to fill out these very detailed forms that talked about the type of interaction they had when they went to facilitate removal of a gun, what kind of guns they collected, where they were, and they were very cooperative in collecting those data. We also had regular contact with the implementation teams to hear in real time from the field how things were going as they set out to implement this law. We also reached out to other stakeholders, so we had conducted interviews with court officials, with victim advocates, to get a sense for how the implementation effort was going from their perspective. And then finally, we were also able to conduct a telephone survey of protected parties who participated in this intervention. And then finally, we also participated in a lot of meetings, attended a lot of meetings, and collected a lot of detailed field notes from those meetings. And in the end, what did we find? Well, we found, sort of our results are a sort of glasses half empty, glasses half full kind of, end of the story, bottom line. On the glasses half full side, we did see in both counties that both implementation teams were able to put a system in place for removing guns. Basically, in both counties, this system was a four-fold kind of process where they had in place a very detailed system for identifying guns that involved looking at existing databases, that involved reviewing every restraining order application and looking at the declarations, looking at whether or not the box on the form that indicated whether or not the respondent had a gun was checked, and also by reaching out to select protected parties and having conversations with protected parties, they had the system in place in both counties that they felt was their best effort to identify those cases in which guns were present. They also laid out a system in both counties for serving these orders, protocols, and sort of a general process for serving these orders and removing those guns. And both counties had in place a system for returning guns at the end of the protective order, should the respondent be eligible to receive their guns back. So the glass is half empty side of this were what the numbers actually look like when we stepped back and said, okay, well, out of the protective orders that were issued in each of the counties, how many cases were there where guns were identified, how many instances were there where guns were actually removed. And we as evaluators were quite shocked, were quite disappointed, to be quite frank, in the numbers that were coming back. So in each county we saw, in Butte County we saw about 2,000 orders being issued, in San Mateo about 6,000. And from among those large pool of protective orders, there, even with that extensive system to identify whether or not the respondent had guns in their possession, it was really a minority of cases in which they were able to identify the presence of guns. Even in Butte County, a county where we were told repeatedly that everybody here has guns, fewer than 100 protective orders were identified through the processes that I described out of 2,000, where the sheriffs were actually able to identify guns being present. And then, a little more than half of those orders that were identified actually resulted in firearms being removed. And when we looked down to see, there were significantly more guns that were removed once they got on scene than were initially identified. But still, these numbers were much, 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 much smaller than we had anticipated. And so what I take away from this is there's so many lessons to be learned, but for the purposes of what we're talking about today, what we learned is that this study of implementation in looking at sort of the very detailed processes proved to be incredibly insightful to understanding what was actually going on in this intervention. So when we stepped back and looked at our data, we realized that while implementation was certainly feasible, we had systems in place in both counties, we learned very quickly that the extent to which these laws could be implemented was really limited by the information that was available about guns from the respondents and by restraining order service. So the second one probably isn't going to be a surprise to this group. We know, we have known for a long time that service of restraining orders is a huge challenge. But the first issue surprised us to the extent that it really showed us sort of the shortcomings in availability of information about gun possession. California has probably one of the best systems for recording information about gun sales, so we really did expect to have more information through that system about respondents' possession of guns. But what does this teach us? Well, one thing that was quite insightful is that when we talked with implementers about this service challenge, why are your numbers of service so low? One of the things that they pointed to is that we really need to be better at the court level about assuring that we get full and complete and accurate information from the protected parties when they're filling out information about how to find the respondent to the protective order. So law enforcement really saw that as a barrier. Also, when we asked them and when we looked at our data with regard to addressing the challenge that comes with finding out information about gun possession, one thing that became very clear was the limitations of California's current system for recording information about gun sales. So at the time that we did this study, mandatory reporting of gun sales included only handguns. And in a county like Butte County, most of the guns we would guess are not handguns. Most of those guns are going to be used for hunting, and they tend to be long guns. So what we were able to do through this study, again, by sort of tracking the implementation, showing the California Department of Justice what kind of information we were able to get about gun possession, what kind of guns we were actually able to collect when we got on site, that provided them with sort of the first ever data on information about people who were prohibited from possessing guns, what guns they actually had, and the shortcomings in the state's current collection system. So California law was actually changed so that the registration system now includes long guns, which was a really exciting development that came out of this implementation study. We also, through this study, again, by looking in detail at the process of implementation, we also really came to appreciate the value of information about guns from protected parties themselves. So one of the things that evolved over the course of the initiative was the inclusion of a gun information sheet with the restraining order packet that is filled out by protected parties who are requesting help from the courts. And with that gun information sheet, with the sheriff's officers looking through the restraining order application forms, and with those conversations that they were able to have with protected parties, what we see is that a majority of the information about guns that came to the officers' attention during this implementation initiative was not through the existing databases, but was from the protected parties themselves. So we thought that this was a very insightful lesson for other agencies who are looking to implement this law. That while you might have existing systems, existing databases that can tell you about who's in possession of guns, your protected parties are really a valuable source of information. The other thing that we take away from this experience is really just more evidence that really supports the policy implementation literature that shows about the importance of people, of the implementers themselves, in realizing implementation of these laws. So we were very struck by the fact that in both counties, they took a very different approach than what we had anticipated. In sort of our pre-intervention rollout, our conversations with the California Department of Justice, we were all expecting that the law enforcement agencies would take a very heavy-handed kind of approach to removing guns, right? We had these sort of visions of, going out in protective gear, large teams, sort of full assault on, these armed, violent people. But in fact, what happened in both counties was actually quite remarkable. They actually took the opposite approach. In both counties, the officers who were in charge of removing guns and facilitating removal really emphasized the importance of going out in plain clothes, of going out in unmarked vehicles, and of being very non-confrontational in addressing this gun surrender issue. And they talked a lot about their role in talking people out of guns. That was a phrase that they used a lot. And the scenario that they presented to us on several occasions was that they would go to a house, serve the order, and in the course of explaining the terms of the order, they would say, well, and as you'll see if you look down here on line 6, the reason that we're also here is because we want to help you be in compliance with this law, and one of the things that happens when you have a restraining order out against you is that you can no longer possess guns. And so if you have any guns, we're here to make sure they're in safekeeping, and we can facilitate that right now. And inevitably what would happen is, resistance from the respondent, a lot of resistance, a lot of, emotion that sort of comes out of this process. And immediately the officers would sort of go into this mode of empathy, of, I know this is terrible. I'm a gun owner. I like to, I like my hunting. I would hate for someone to come here and tell me that I have to give up my guns. I know how important they are. But the reality is you're in a bit of trouble right now, and it's not going to go away. And the best thing that you can do right now is to comply with the law. And I'm going to help you to do that. And it was amazing to us as to how effective they were in talking people out of their guns. And again, in very diverse communities, in a very rural population where people are sleeping with their guns, it seems like. I mean, they have no desire to give them up. And in a suburban, county where, guns are not necessarily used for hunting, but, oftentimes people are going to bring guns into the home for self-protection. So very different communities. We can hypothesize that they're bringing guns into their home for very different reasons. But this sort of approach of empathy and non-confrontational and working with a person really seemed to work from the perspective of the officers in terms of the best way to realize surrender in these instances. So again, that really taught us the importance of practitioner perspectives in thinking about how to implement laws and policies around IPV interventions. So other lessons learned. In both counties, we saw that there were sort of similarities in challenges that they saw with regard to context. Both had challenges with regard to where to store the guns that they resolved differently. And both talked about how by training officers and by having dedicated officers who were focused on implementing this law, they sort of became the local experts with regard to policies related to domestic violence and guns, because people in their counties really didn't know how to handle guns in IPV situations. So these people became the go-to people, and they would get calls from judges, they would get calls from advocates. I have this case where I don't know what to do because I have a client who's telling me that her partner is armed and she's very much afraid of him, but she doesn't want to get a protective order out. What are my options? So these officers became a resource for their counties in many different and unanticipated ways. There were some differences, though, between the sites that we thought were also important to highlight and that come out of implementation studies like this. So in Butte County, in the smaller county, we saw very quickly that people became aware of this intervention, and it became known that if you had a restraining order out against you, that someone was going to come looking for you and ask you to surrender your guns. So the sheriff's offices started to see voluntary surrender of these guns once they got rolling with this intervention, which, again, was a surprise. That kind of spread didn't happen in San Mateo County. We also saw in Butte County that there was sort of a less formality that was required in terms of pursuing some changes. So we had a lot of cooperation from judges in Butte County, which made a lot of administrative changes to facilitate surrender a lot easier. So, in short, when I think about how implementation science can really be valuable to intimate partner violence research and to where we're moving with this field, it's clear to me that the value of collaboration with practitioners is incredibly important. And this idea that we need to be focusing on how interventions work, not just whether they work. We need to be focusing on the details of what goes on in those clinical or community settings to understand why people who are charged with implementing interventions are or are not doing them is really essential to moving us to the next level. And in that regard, mixed methods, I think we've seen throughout the morning how important the variety of methods are to really understanding what's going on the ground with regard to our interventions and making sure that we use all the tools in our toolbox when doing this kind of research. And just focusing on the details of these implementation processes is really the crux of what implementation science is about. What does it take to make the interventions that we know work, and what are the actions and behaviors that we need to move in order to realize those efficacious results? So that's the summary of what I wanted to share with you really quickly. Again, happy to be here, and if anybody would like to talk further about these issues, please don't hesitate to give me a call or send me an email. Thanks very much again.